On February 20, 2026, the United States Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling in the case of Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump. The decision completely invalidated the administration's sweeping IEEPA tariffs. The 6-3 majority opinion, authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, rejected the administration's expansive interpretation of emergency trade powers. The court held that the executive branch had bypassed its boundaries, determining that the IEEPA statute does not authorize the unilateral imposition of tariffs. This ruling created a massive budgetary and legal mess for the Treasury. An estimated $166 billion to $175 billion in collected tariffs was instantly reclassified as an illegal government extraction. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officially ordered the cessation of all IEEPA duty collections nationwide, forcing a hard stop to the revenue stream. Before they were struck down, these illegal duties were exacted from over 330,000 registered importers. They impacted more than 53 million individual import entries moving through the American supply chain. With a single strike of a gavel, the government acknowledged it had executed one of the largest unlawful tax extractions in modern history, creating a $175 billion liability it now had to resolve. While the legal debate played out in federal courts, the economic destruction of the 2025 tariff period was already deeply embedded in local communities. Operating costs for domestic companies surged under the weight of the duties. Over 700 U.S. businesses filed for bankruptcy during the rollout, marking the highest rate of corporate failures in 15 years. In Las Vegas alone, a neighborhood cupcake shop, an independent brewery, and a coffee roaster were forced to permanently shut their doors when their supply costs skyrocketed beyond sustainable margins. This bar chart compares standard household supply costs against the actual price hikes caused by the policy. A Federal Reserve Bank of New York confirmed that U.S. firms and consumers ultimately bore 90% of the economic burden, costing the average American household up to $1,745. Look at how the data shifts when we isolate retail fuel. Consumer spending at U.S. gas stations surged 21% in April 2026 alone, pushing the national average to $4.56 a gallon. Financially distressed shoppers were recorded buying fewer than 10 gallons per visit just to make it through the week. The trade policy functioned as an invisible domestic tax that systematically drained the wallets of the American working class. The Supreme Court ruling created a massive logistical problem. The U.S. Treasury, already paying $880 billion on net interest for the national debt in 2024, is now legally obligated to return the $175 billion collected under IEEPA. But the everyday consumers who actually funded this historic extraction through higher retail prices are legally barred from claiming a single cent of the refund. Customs law is strictly governed by the concept of the importer of record. Only the corporate entities that officially remitted the duties to the government are legally eligible to claim the reimbursement. This bubble chart maps the $175 billion federal refund pool. Walmart is positioned to receive up to $10.2 billion. Target is eligible for $2.2 billion. Tech giant Apple, which spent over $3 billion on tariffs, is legally in line to reclaim those exact funds. Because these massive retailers already passed their tariff costs onto the public through higher shelf prices, these refunds do not act as restitution. The $175 billion functions as a taxpayer-subsidized cash injection for the world's richest companies. To handle the massive volume of corporate claims, Customs and Border Protection rapidly deployed Phase 1 of the CAPE online refund portal directly inside their existing digital infrastructure. Within just weeks of the system launching, the portal processed importer applications demanding a staggering $85 billion in tariff refunds. The government's validation process moved with unusual speed. CBP quickly approved 108,760 individual refund declarations with virtually no friction. Immediately following validation, an initial block of $20.6 billion was cleared for direct cash disbursement into corporate bank accounts. By late May 2026, discount retailer Dollar Tree had already successfully secured and pocketed an initial $110 million in actual cash from the government. A federal bureaucracy typically associated with gridlock successfully engineered a high-speed digital pipeline to enrich corporations while completely excluding the citizens who actually paid the bill. As the sheer scale of the corporate payouts became public knowledge, shoppers realized the nature of the loophole and mobilized against the retailers who profited from the price hikes. Furious consumers filed class action lawsuits against Amazon and Costco. Court filings in Illinois alleged the e-commerce giants purposefully inflated prices by up to 5.2% to offset duties, and then deliberately refused to return the windfall to buyers. The legal retaliation expanded directly into the logistics sector. UPS and FedEx were sued for explicitly billing their customers with itemized IEEPA duty surcharges on shipping invoices, and then unjustly retaining the profits. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers launched a legislative counterattack. Senators introduced the Tariff Refund Act of 2026, a bill designed to force CBP to pay out the entire $175 billion refund pool with interest within a strict 180-day window. Representative Stephen Horsford directly intervened, sending formal letters to 10 major corporate CEOs demanding transparent accountability regarding exactly where the $175 billion was going. This complex customs dispute has escalated into a nationwide class war over the ownership of the capital moving through the American supply chain. Then, the entire payout machine abruptly stopped. On June 2, 2026, the Department of Justice officially filed an aggressive appeal to the Federal Circuit to halt the universal refund order. The DOJ's tactical goal is clear. They're seeking to strictly limit the refund pool exclusively to the specific corporate plaintiffs who actively filed lawsuits, effectively freezing the vast majority of the $175 billion in government accounts. The trade courts fired back immediately. Court of International Trade Judge Richard Eaton issued a show cause order demanding the CBP commissioner testify in person to answer for the sudden delay in payouts. Simultaneously, the administration announced Plan B, a brand new proposal to impose a 10% across-the-board global tariff by utilizing entirely different statutory authorities to bypass the judicial blockade. This compounding chaos operates alongside the Section 232 steel tariffs and Section 301 Chinese tariffs, which remain legally active and untouched by the Supreme Court. The $17 billion liability is now deadlocked in a three-way war between the Department of Justice, federal trade courts, and multinational corporations. As the government fights to keep the money and corporations fight to claim it, the U.S. taxpayer remains trapped at the bottom, guaranteed to bear the ultimate cost. A pool of $175 billion sits frozen, caught in an administrative standoff between the White House and the federal courts. This conflict centers on the absolute basics of American law. The Constitution gives one specific branch the power to lay and collect tariffs: Congress. The president lacks the authority to tax the public. During World War I, Congress created the first major exception to this rule. The Trading with the Enemy Act gave the president temporary authority to impose tariffs as a tool for managing the wartime economy. In 1971, Richard Nixon used that same wartime law to address a national balance of payments deficit. He placed a 10% tariff on all major global trading partners. Nixon lifted the tariff after only 5 months, but the Department of Justice successfully defended the move in court. In the Yoshida case, the judiciary ruled that the executive could legally use those delegated wartime powers to regulate trade. That victory for the White House alarmed lawmakers. It proved that an executive could use an aging wartime statute to independently alter global trade and raise costs for American consumers. Congress responded in 1977 by passing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. It was a direct attempt to strip those sweeping emergency powers back from the president. Congress intentionally deleted aggressive verbs like confiscate and sell from the president toolkit, but left the vague phrase regulate importation. Following this, the boundaries held for half a century. Presidents invoked IEEPA for 69 emergencies without ever using that clause to impose a tariff. On February 1, 2025, President Trump broke that precedent. He invoked the IEEPA to broadly tax global goods, claiming the statute gave him the authority to bypass Congress. The scale of duties grew quickly, 25% on Canada and Mexico, up to 125% on China, and eliminating exemptions for low-value shipments. By utilizing the IEEPA this way, the administration moved the final authority over national tax policy from the legislative branch to the Oval Office. The system reacted within weeks. A coalition of 12 states, led by Oregon, alongside small businesses represented by the Liberty Justice Center, filed parallel lawsuits challenging the legality of the new duties. The U.S. Court of International Trade ruled on the case quickly. By mid-2025, the court declared the executive orders an existential threat to the plaintiffs and held the tariffs unlawful. The administration appealed, and by November 2025, the case reached the Supreme Court. The Department of Justice argued that the president's inherent foreign affairs powers allowed him to use the phrase regulate importation as a mandate to tariff. The challengers countered that giving the president unbounded tariff authority violated the non-delegation doctrine. They argued that if the executive could tax at will, the legislature's role in the government was effectively finished. This was a direct test of whether the executive branch could unilaterally rewrite federal trade laws and keep the revenue. On February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court delivered a 6-3 decision against the administration in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion, explicitly stating that the IEEPA statute does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The ruling halted the operation. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officially announced they would cease the collection of all IEEPA duties on February 24th. This data visualization shows the financial consequence. The ruling link classified $175 billion in collected duties as an illegal seizure of private funds. While the decision restored the separation of powers, it left the government holding a massive, unplanned debt to thousands of private companies. Halting the collection was only the first step. In March 2026, Trade Court Judge Richard Eaton ordered Customs and Border Protection to process universal refunds for every importer of record. CBP responded by launching the CAPE refund portal. Within weeks, 26,000 importers, representing $120 billion in duties, had registered for their money. But the Department of Justice challenged the order. They appealed to the Federal Circuit, actively working to block the universal refund mandate. The DOJ argued that the courts lacked the power to issue universal injunctions. They moved to strictly limit the refunds only to the specific companies that had filed their own individual lawsuits. The maneuver stalled the process. Applications for $85 billion in refunds already moving through the system were suddenly blocked by the administration's appeal. The Supreme Court had declared the collection illegal, but the executive branch's administrative defiance effectively trapped the owed money in bureaucratic limbo. This delay had a direct impact on the public. The Joint Economic Committee estimated that the 2025 price hikes cost the average U.S. family $1,745. On Capitol Hill, senators introduced the Tariff Refund Act of 2026. The bill demands CBP repay the entire $175 billion with interest within 180 days. At the same time, logistics companies like FedEx and UPS faced class action lawsuits. These companies had itemized the IEEPA duties as surcharges on customer bills, passing the costs directly to the consumers. Under the pressure of litigation, FedEx and DHL committed to returning any CAPE refunds directly to the original paying customers. Despite court losses and legislative pressure, the administration pivoted to Plan B. They drafted a new proposal to impose 10% tariffs under Section 122. The Constitution survived the initial test, reestablishing the limits of executive authority, but the $175 billion war over restitution remains unresolved. As billions in tariff refunds are processed, economists warn that directly injecting this cash back into the economy could dramatically worsen U.S. inflation. This massive pool of global capital traces back to February 1, 2025. On that day, President Donald Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to launch a broad series of import tariffs. The fentanyl and trafficking tariffs hit Mexico and Canada with 25% duties, while China was targeted simultaneously with duties between 10 and 20%. While these tariffs were leveraged as geopolitical tools, their implementation immediately began to pull a staggering amount of liquid capital out of the domestic supply chain. By April 2025, the policy expanded into what was called Liberation Day. Most global trading partners were suddenly hit with taxes ranging from 10 to 50%. The scope of the duties was often unexpected. Brazil faced a 40% tax following a domestic court ruling, while Switzerland, A U.S. ally with a trade surplus, was struck with a 39% tariff. India was also caught in the dragnet, as the administration used tariffs as a pressure point to influence the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Through these combined efforts, U.S. Customs and Border Protection collected an estimated $166 billion to $175 billion in IEEPA duties. But foreign governments didn't pay this bill. This $175 billion was funded entirely by the American businesses and consumers at the end of the supply chain. The logistical reality of the policy was immense. Over 330,000 American importers of record had to pay these duties across more than 53 million individual import entries. Major corporations saw their cash reserves drain rapidly. Apple spent over $3 billion on the new tariffs, while Nike faced an annual impact exceeding $1 billion. To protect their margins, these companies moved to pass the cost of the tariffs directly to the American public. Costco allegedly raised retail prices by as much as 30%. On an earnings call, CEO Ron Vakras admitted the company increased prices because it felt members would be able to absorb the cost. This chart shows how that absorption looked in practice. Between January and July 2025, prices for inexpensive goods on Amazon spiked 5.2%, more than double the standard inflation rate for core goods. Shipping giants like FedEx, UPS, and DHL took it a step further, adding itemized IEEPA duty surcharges directly to their customers' invoices. The result was a highly effective wealth transfer mechanism, siphoning money from consumer wallets to the federal treasury through the prices of everyday goods. On Main Street, the pressure was often too much to bear. In 2025, over 700 U.S. businesses filed for bankruptcy, the highest rate the country had seen in 15 years. In Las Vegas, 3 local staples, a cupcake shop, a brewery, and a coffee roaster, were all forced to close permanently as their operating costs became unsustainable. The trade war hit just as a second crisis arrived. War in the Middle East and blockages in the Strait of Hormuz trapped oil tankers and choked off global energy supplies. Fuel prices skyrocketed. When the national average hit $4.56 a gallon, Walmart reported that lower-income customers were forced to buy less than 10 gallons of gas per visit. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that U.S. firms and consumers bore 90% of the tariff burden, costing the average American family over $1,700. Between soaring fuel costs and new trade taxes, the American middle class found itself caught in a perfect economic storm. The policy reached its end on February 20, 2026, when the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, declaring them invalid. This ruling instantly turned $175 billion in collected taxes into illegitimate revenue, sparking a massive corporate scramble to get that money back. Customs and Border Protection launched the Cape portal to handle the volume, quickly receiving over 157,000 refund declarations from customs brokers and corporations. The bureaucracy moved fast for major importers, clearing over $20 billion for immediate disbursement to the Treasury for processing. This bar chart shows the scale of the pending payouts. Walmart is eligible for up to $10.2 billion in refunds. Target is in line for $2.2 billion, and Nike expects to claim $1 billion. While the legal system is working to make these multi-billion-dollar corporations whole, the individual citizens who paid the higher prices have been left out of the equation. The reason is a specific technicality in customs law. Only the importer of record, the entity that physically brought the goods into the country, has a legal claim to the refund. Because consumers aren't the importers of record, they are legally excluded from the government's refund portal, even if they were the ones who ultimately paid the tax at the register. Now, a new legal battle is brewing. The Department of Justice is appealing the refund process, a move that could disrupt $85 billion in pending applications. To protect that claims, over 2,000 companies have filed lawsuits in the Court of International Trade, a legal hurdle that many small businesses simply cannot afford to navigate. This massive injection of corporate cash is heading toward an economy where the U.S. Treasury is already paying $880 billion just in interest on the national debt. The public was drained of $175 billion to fund this trade policy. If the resulting refunds now trigger a new round of inflation, the American people will effectively be forced to pay for the trade war a second time. By the peak of the crisis, the inflation shock became a daily physical reality. At the pump, the national average for a gallon of regular petrol jumped to $4.56, an aggressive $1.38 increase from the previous year. The severity of the financial distress among lower-income consumers was confirmed by Walmart's chief financial officer, who noted that shoppers were actively rationing fuel, buying fewer than 10 gallons per visit just to scrape by. This chart tracks the direct financial extraction from the American household. The Joint Economic Committee estimated these specific tariff policies stripped up to $1,745 from the average family, projecting the deficit to expand past $2,500 throughout 2026. While households rationed their spending, executives insulated themselves. On a public earnings call, Costco's CEO admitted that retail prices were intentionally hiked simply because the company felt its members could absorb the tariff costs. That absorption happened everywhere. Wall Street Journal data confirmed Amazon's prices for inexpensive goods increased by 5.2%, drastically outpacing standard inflation. Multinational giants like Nike and Apple aggressively raised prices, directly passing billions in tariff expenses onto the public. This inflation crisis functioned as a direct transfer of wealth. Corporate margins were prioritized, leaving the working-class consumer to carry the full weight of the economic adjustment. Beyond domestic retail, global supply chains began to fracture. The escalating Iran war and simultaneous blockages in the Strait of Hormuz trapped oil tankers, restricting energy supplies and causing international freight expenses to skyrocket. The administration compounded this chaos by striking out at traditional allies. Switzerland was unexpectedly hit with a 39% tariff simply for maintaining a trade surplus, and the United States imposed a punitive 40% tariff on Brazil, explicitly because its Supreme Court permitted the prosecution of a former president. In retaliation, global powers choked the physical inputs required for modern manufacturing. China enacted export controls on rare earth magnets, a maneuver that immediately threatened to shut down the global industrial base. The resulting macroeconomic shockwaves hit local American main streets directly. Neighborhood mainstays, including a Las Vegas bakery, a coffee roaster, and a brewery, were forced to permanently close their doors as operating costs became entirely unmanageable. In 2025, more than 700 U.S. businesses filed for bankruptcy under the crushing pressure of the administration's tariffs, reaching the highest failure rate the country had seen in 15 years. While the administration used trade as a tool of foreign policy, the most immediate impact was felt domestically, as small business owners were left to absorb the cost of a bankruptcy wave they had no hand in creating. The United States Court of International Trade attempted to intervene in the mounting damage. The court mandated universal tariff refunds to return the unlawfully collected duties to affected parties. As an immediate countermeasure, the Department of Justice filed a formal appeal to forcibly halt $85 billion in universal refunds. The DOJ argued customs lacked statutory authority, insisting payments required companies to individually file lawsuits. The CAPE portal's eligibility requirements remained narrow. Following federal customs law, the system restricted tariff refunds exclusively to the importers of record, leaving everyday consumers with no legal path to reclaim their money. The administration's posture regarding this lockout was entirely unapologetic. On national television, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent smirked as he dismissed the concept of direct consumer relief, stating he had a feeling the American people won't see it. The result was an $85 billion legal firewall, ensuring wealth extracted from the public remained precisely where the administration wanted it, out of reach. The Department of Justice's strategy of limiting refunds strictly to named litigants meant that small enterprises, lacking the capital to mount individual legal challenges, were left legally paralyzed and vulnerable. This vulnerability became a business opportunity for political insiders. On August 14, 2025, a Senate Finance Committee probe was launched, exposing severe institutional corruption surrounding the stalled payouts. The investigation targeted a specific firm, once run by the Commerce Secretary and currently run by his son. The firm was found to be buying the rights to tariff refunds from distressed small businesses for pennies on the dollar. At the same time, consumers filed class action lawsuits against major corporations. Amazon was formally accused of refusing to seek hundreds of millions in government refunds, allegedly leaving the money unclaimed to curry political favor with the administration. The system allowed the politically connected to profit from the distress of American business owners, generating immense wealth for those positioned on the inside. While small businesses were stripped of their assets, major corporations flooded the courts. Over 2,000 companies, including Toyota and Revlon, filed individual protective lawsuits in the Court of International Trade to legally secure their own payouts. Retail giants like Target and Walmart positioned themselves to receive federal payouts of $2.2 billion and $10.2 billion, respectively, with zero legislative requirements guaranteeing they would pass those refunds down to consumers. Representative Stephen Horsford sent formal letters demanding accountability from 10 major CEOs, seeking hard commitments that these massive taxpayer refunds would not be quietly funneled into executive compensation or stock buybacks. The courts attempted to force answers. Judge Richard Eaton rejected the DOJ's motion to shield officials, issuing a show cause order that demanded the Customs and Border Protection Commissioner testify in person regarding the deliberately delayed refunds. CBP officials admitted their manual administrative procedures were incapable of processing 53 million entry-specific refunds. Doing so would require redirecting vital personnel, forcing the agency to abandon posts designed to stop illicit transshipped goods. Megacorporations easily afforded the high-priced litigation necessary to secure their billions in lifeboats, while the government's own administrative failures ensured everyday consumers were left behind. Within hours of their defeat at the Supreme Court, the administration refused to retreat, immediately announcing Plan B to enforce a new 10% tariff. This alternative plan sought to exploit Section 122 and Section 232 national security investigations, utilizing alternative statutory authorities to bypass the Supreme Court's ruling entirely. An analysis by the Budget Lab at Yale warned that making these replacement tariffs permanent would increase household losses by up to an additional $940. The constant threat of fluctuating tariffs and sudden statutory actions forced U.S. firms to permanently relocate their manufacturing facilities out of China, restructuring supply chains to survive. This data visualization illustrates the immense scale of the resulting liability. The total cost of the crisis reached $175 billion, dwarfing prior economic interventions. The $175 billion liability stands as the largest single government debt event of its kind. It is a crisis engineered by the state, hoarded by corporations, and settled by the financial ruin of the American family. Right now, the U.S. government is processing a $175 billion financial liability. Through a system called the CAPE portal, federal agencies are actively handling massive tariff refunds to corporations, even as the broader economic crisis remains unresolved. CBP has processed over 157,400 declarations, clearing $85 billion for immediate payout from the $166 billion refund pool. But the DOJ filed an appeal to forcibly halt this order, limiting refunds strictly to named plaintiffs and stripping away restitution for hundreds of thousands of other companies. The administration's intervention prompted a highly unusual response. Trade Judge Richard Eaton issued a show cause order, demanding CBP Commissioner Rodney Scott testify in person to explain the deliberate delay. The federal process is currently structured to prioritize high-level corporate legal battles. As agencies fight over which importing firm gets paid, ordinary citizens remain outside the scope of the refund mechanism. American shoppers are legally locked out of the CBP refund portal entirely. Because everyday consumers are not classified as official importers of record, they have no direct legal avenue to reclaim their money from the government. This area chart shows the true distribution of the 2025 tariff burden. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, households absorbed roughly 90% of the economic penalty, costing the average American family between $1,700 and $1,745. Those household losses directly contrast with the payouts earmarked for major importing firms. Walmart is positioned to potentially receive up to $10.2 billion in federal refunds, while Target is eligible for an estimated $2.2 billion. When pressed on whether the government would return any of this capital to the public, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent dismissed the possibility on national television, stating he had a feeling the American people wouldn't see it. Under the parameters of the current legal system, money extracted from everyday shoppers via higher retail prices at checkout is now flowing directly into the accounts of multinational retailers. Consumers are beginning to retaliate through the courts. Retailers face a wave of class action lawsuits for price gouging, citing evidence like Amazon's 5.2% price spike on low-cost goods between January and July 2025. The litigation extends across the supply chain. Logistics giants UPS and FedEx are facing their own lawsuits for charging consumers explicit, itemized IEEPA duty surcharges on their invoices. Independent enterprises lack the resources to absorb these shocks. The sudden elimination of the de minimis exemption in late 2025 subjected all international shipments under $800 to immediate taxation, disrupting low-value e-commerce. Small operations lack the capital reserves to wait for government disbursements. Subjected to the immediate costs of IEEPA tariffs and the loss of the de minimis exemption, over 700 U.S. businesses filed for bankruptcy in 2025, the highest rate in 15 years. While megacorporations have the capital to wait out years of litigation, the intersection of rising supply costs and delayed refunds has pushed the corporate bankruptcy rate to a 15-year high. In an attempt to address the fallout, lawmakers like Senator Martin Herring introduced the Tariff Refunds for Working Families Act. The bill proposes bypassing the complex refund portal entirely by granting a direct $1,200 rebate to joint filers. Financial experts have immediately flagged the risk of this approach. Injecting billions of dollars in targeted liquid cash back into the domestic economy right now carries a risk of further accelerating domestic inflation. The broader economy is already highly destabilized. The conflict in Iran and trapped oil tankers blockading the Strait of Hormuz have driven the national average price of gasoline to $4.56 a gallon, a $1.38 increase in a single year. Private equity is leveraging this exact vulnerability. An investment firm run by the son of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is currently under Senate investigation for buying the legal rights to tariff refunds from distressed small businesses for pennies on the dollar. With energy prices high and the Strait of Hormuz constrained, experts warn that releasing billions in liquid rebates risks accelerating the current rate of inflation. Rather than dismantle the contested policies, the administration has announced Plan B. Utilizing Section 122 of the Trade Act, they have proposed a new 10% across-the-board global tariff. Section 122 duties are additive, stacking on top of the fully active Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs. The USTR recommends applying these punitive duties to 60 distinct economies, including key trade allies, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. In late 2025, China launched retaliatory global export controls on rare earth magnets, directly threatening the manufacturing capabilities of the entire U.S. industrial base. What began as a domestic legal dispute over executive authority has compounded. By implementing secondary trade penalties, the government has transformed a domestic failure into an escalating global trade war. The mathematics of this escalation are rigid. The tax foundation projects that the remaining tariffs alone will result in a mandatory tax increase of $700 per U.S. household in 2026. The Yale Budget Lab tracks this trajectory further. If the new Section 122 tariffs become permanent, average short-term household losses will push toward $940. Despite collecting billions in tariff revenue, the government's borrowing costs are rising. In 2024, the U.S. Treasury paid $880 billion purely on net interest for the national debt. That marks an escalation from the previous year's interest cost of $658 billion, revealing a trajectory where debt servicing costs are outstripping the revenue generated by trade policy. The compounding pressure of retaliatory tariffs, disrupted supply chains, and mounting federal debt funnels directly down to the consumer. If the policies remain unchanged, the Joint Economic Committee projects the cost to every American household will surpass $2,500 in 2026.